Hello, and welcome to a very different sort of Colts Cover-2 podcast from the free agency week of the NFL. It's a very different Colts Cover-2 podcast because the Colts did things on the first couple of days of free agency for the first time in a long time. Trying to think. I know Devin Funchess signed on the first day. That's probably not a signing people want me to bring up. There was the DeForest Buckner trade that broke, right away. There just hasn't been much, but this year the Colts completely overhauled their secondary. Chris Ballard has been very little secret of the need that he felt that they had there. He just kept saying we've got to be better at that spot. At the combine, he outlined he likes Jalen Jones, Nick Cross, and Kenny Moore, which by extension told you that he didn't like one corner spot and he didn't like one free safety spot. They sign Camryn Bynum to play the safety. They signed Charvarius Ward to play cornerback, and all of a sudden, this secondary looks very, very different.
Yeah, it's kind of like hell is frozen over, and the Colts are spending wild early in free agency, and not just getting players, but premium position players, cornerbacks, defensive backs, the type of stuff that Chris Ballard has always or very long put off and found ways around. And it's interesting to think about because on one hand, it's such a departure from everything he's done. On the other hand, it's also, like you just laid out, exactly what he said he was going to do. And you look at some of the other things that he's said this offseason, and he talked about, they needed fresh blood on defense to kind of counteract some of the stuff that Kenny Moore and DeForest Buckner were talking about with complacency and egos. Guys from the outside who've done it in other places. That to me meant to really follow through with that. You needed more than just you need guys who are going to play for you and guys who have played elsewhere. And these two, Bynum and Charvarius Ward, have played in the playoffs. And it's interesting. I have to, Charvarius Ward's he's played in, very interesting for him. He's played in 2 Super Bowls for the Chiefs against the Niners and for the Niners against the Chiefs. So very interesting the way that worked out. But yeah, and then other stuff that Chris Ballard has said has held up. We talked about, I had asked him about that, the temptation with in-house free agents at the combine and what the balance is of intentionally leaving spots open to bring in that fresh blood while also knowing more about your own guys. And that's when he said Mike Bloom is going to have a lot of work to do. And Mike Bloom is who runs the Colts salary cap. Well, all of a sudden, not only are the Colts spending money like they normally don't, they're also structuring deals the way they normally don't, where they are backloading some of these contracts, lowering the cap hit, pushing a lot of the money to future years so that they can keep adding for this year, which they later did with adding Daniel Jones at quarterback. So this is all very different, and it's everything Chris Ballard has said is going to come. So it's just sort of like, I'm glad we're finally here, because for so long, what we talk about on this podcast without a lot of discussion or answers is, will Chris Ballard actually follow through? And this week, I think, was the clearest example of following through. It's so different than what he's done, but also especially recently. I got here in 2021, so this is the 4th offseason, and the only thing I can think of them doing in the first week that wasn't an in-house move in those 3 off seasons before this was, I think that might have been when they traded for Yannick Ngakoue with the Raiders.
Oh, yep. That was the opening of the new league year.
Yeah, so that happened in 2022, but I struggle to even think of another move. I mean, I think Rodney McLeod came late in the weekend of that first week, maybe for a league minimum deal. I mean, there's really nothing to compare it to in terms of early movement. He's done a couple of other decent swings, but only a couple. Samson Ebukam and Stephon Gilmore, they ended up waiting on. But this was aggressive. This was actually winning bidding wars for guys who clearly were very in demand. This was meeting guys on levels that they normally don't when it comes to signing bonuses. That's been and guarantees. That's been one thing that I know that outside free agents have not loved about this place, is even when they've been willing to meet certain annual dollar amounts, they tend to get, in the past, they've gotten stiff a little bit with some of the bonus and structure type stuff. And this stuff, the stuff they're doing with Camryn Bynum and Charvarius Ward and even Daniel Jones, big departure from that. So I think it shows that Chris Ballard really did learn, and last year really did hit him hard. I think especially on defense, especially when it was no longer outside voices like, and naysayers like us on a podcast criticizing, but it was his own leaders that built the culture saying, this is not good enough. This is not working. I think that really stung him. It also shows that I think these guys are feeling the heat in ways that they haven't in the past. And that's a new version of Chris Ballard that we're seeing play out right now.
The only move I can think of that really matches this one, because even the Ngakoue trade was a 1-for-1. They traded away a player to get him, a starting player. Now Rocky Sin isn't, huge difference maker, but they traded a player. Is the move to get Buckner. That's the only other time I can think of, a really big move early on, and then a paycheck to go along with it. Early on in free agency that he's done. Even some of his better free agent classes early on in his tenure, some of his best free agent signings are more like wait around and then find the undervalued asset. Danico Autry was that way. Eric Ebron was that way when they signed him. Xavier Rhodes. Stephon Gilmore even fits that to some category since he didn't sign till April. His best signings have been kind of waiting around for values to come down and then landing something that's undervalued and getting more out of it than people thought. The only off season where they made two decisive moves like this is that I can think of right away is 2020, and that was Buckner. And then I usually tend to push quarterback out of this because quarterback is often such a necessity move. But the Rivers one, Phillip Rivers, they actually didn't have to because they'd already paid Jacoby Brissett. There's a world where if you wanted to talk yourself into his performance, the way Chris Ballard has talked himself into other incumbent players' performances, that he could have said, Jacoby showed us some stuff. We want to see if he can get more. We've already paid him. Let's just get another backup. And they got a replacement. So I think that I would count Rivers in that too. The Buckner Rivers offseason is the one that sticks out to me. The thing that sticks out to me about the secondary is just, it's been 2 years now of him saying the secondary is a problem. We're going to see if these young guys can do it. And ultimately, he finally admitted, you can't rely on that alone. Ultimately, he finally, and which is interesting to me because, and this is where, so at his postseason press conference, he talked a lot about getting away from what he'd done earlier in his tenure with free agency. And to that point, his best secondary acquisitions outside of Kenny Moore, who was a waiver claim, and doesn't really count because of just the unpredictability of what a waiver claim is going to do. His best secondary acquisitions have all been free agents. Xavier Rhodes, TJ Carey, Rodney McLeod, Stephon Gilmore. All of those guys, Pierre Desir, even in the first year, are guys who they found in free agency and then they outperformed their deals. This is a different one, though. These are two different ones, though, in that they had to pay top of the market for them. But to me, him doing that in the secondary is maybe a little bit of an acknowledgement that, I'm not drafting starters and long-term starters to the cornerback position. I have to go get one. And at safety, both Malik Hooker and Julian Blackmon had flashes, but they had significant availability issues. And Camryn Bynum has played 51 games in the last 3 years, which is the amount of games that you play if you play full seasons. So I think there's some correction there of recognizing where he actually has done well in the secondary and trying to fix what's gone wrong.
I think that's part of it. I think also there's a realization that there's got to be a difference between liking your young players and trusting them to do ever more than they really should ever be asked to do. And so it was interesting that he labeled Nick Cross and Jalen Jones and said, I like these guys and they're ascending. And now he's set it up to where those are the 4th and 5th best starters in his secondary. And it's set up, the fit is there now to where those guys there is a lot to like about them. They both today were in the top 10 of performance-based pay from last season. It was certainly their best season so far, but they have limitations. I mean, they have, Jalen Jones, he's a very, very durable, very, hard worker, smart kid who's very physical, does not have long speed. And so, and is not, he's just not he's a great success story for a 7th round pick. He's not one of those very few corners in the league who can match up with Justin Jefferson or Malik Neighbors or Brian Thomas Jr., these guys who just ripped the Colts last year. But he's a very different player when he's matched up on your number 2 and when he gets to play in short area. So you had Charvarius Ward, bumps him over to the other side. So instead of facing Justin Jefferson, he's facing, Jalen Naylor, that type of, switch in the matchup. Instead of facing Malik Neighbors against the Giants, he gets to face Darius Slayton. Much more manageable matchups where he can be who he wants to be. Nick Cross, similar deal where Nick Cross was, you had said this before we got on, so I credit you for this take because I hadn't thought this through, but it's probably true. He probably was the best tackler on the team last year. Now, that wasn't exactly the hardest race to win for the team that led the league in missed tackles, but he very much showed that part of his game, the physicality, big hits, pretty secure hits, and could make some plays in the ball. Where Nick Cross is not maybe as equipped as some others is coverage, especially man coverage down the field, and some of the communication. It's not as much his style, and he's still a young player. So you bring in Camryn Bynum, who you shift more of that communication responsibility to, especially with the way Lou Anarumo, it's not just one guy's in the box and one guy's way back in free safety. It will rotate. They'll play off each other. And it's going to keep Nick Cross close to the ball where he can be physical, but he doesn't have to be that communication captain the way that position was in Gus Bradley's defense. And then I just think Bynum adds to that with Jalen Jones of having a safety over top that's highly reliable to let him play in short areas rather than down the field. You can push him more on that side when you have Charvarius Ward. And then we know what Kenny Moore is, and I think it's going to free up Kenny Moore. We can get into that some too. But beyond the talent level dramatically improving with these moves, I think the fit is immensely better. And that was one of the biggest issues I had with last year was it wasn't just the investments were not as high. The overall just total sum of the parts wasn't all that impressive, but it just felt like some of the positions they were going to put these guys in with Jalen Jones covering Justin Jefferson and, Nick Cross having to communicate when he moves to strong safety. It just was not the optimum use of the players. And now they're finding a way to put these guys in the best positions. And I think we're going to see a big, big difference because of that.
There's also a piece of it where this is a welcome mat for Lou Anarumo.
Yeah.
I saw several fans on Blue Sky who said Gus Bradley has to be furious somewhere right now. He's spent 2 years needing secondary players. Ballard wouldn't get him for him. Anarumo shows up and he gets, one of the best safeties on the market and one of the best corners on the market. Anarumo's defenses were at their best in Cincinnati when he had veteran secondaries. And I would go so far as to say this secondary, as at least on paper, is right up there with the ones he had in Minnesota. Camryn Bynum, not like a superstar, but also one of the interesting things with the safety market, I thought, was that, on most free agent lists, it was sort of tabbed that Javon Holland was the Xavier McKinney this year and was going to make way more than everybody else. Well, sometimes the lists get it wrong because he basically made roughly the same as everybody else. Trevon Moehrig from the Raiders actually signed the biggest deal, and he wouldn't have been in play here because he's a strong safety. So the market said, whatever you think about Holland, we don't think he's much different than Hufanga from the Niners or Bynum, who went to the Hufanga went to the Broncos, and then Bynum, who went to the Colts. The NFL just didn't see it the same way, which makes Bynum a top of market type guy. That's another piece of it. I think for Anarumo, like Bynum is coming from Brian Flores' defenses, which are just as complex and blitz more and put their safeties in a lot of spots. And so Bynum should be right at home in Anarumo's game plan style defense. Ward is a guy who played for Steve Spagnuolo and then played in San Francisco's defensive tradition. Two very different schemes. So he's going to have the ability, I would think, 7 years into the league, to do what Anarumo needs to do on a snap-to-snap basis. That helps. Instead of them relying on rookies or guys who've essentially never played before at corner, like the youngest guy they're going to rely on at corner as it's constructed right now is in his third season as a starter and has played 2,000 snaps. Safety, Nick Cross has a full season under his belt. You're not just kind of going with Rodney Thomas or Nick Cross or bust. It's a very different bet in the secondary. I think it helps a guy like Anarumo a ton.
Yeah, it's interesting to compare this to the best Bengals secondaries he had, because I think it is an interesting contrast. So you think about like Jesse Bates was the best player he had, and I don't think they have a singular Jesse Bates, just because that's an all-pro, absolute superstar. So Bynum's totally very, very good, but that's a step up. But what they do have that is better than what he had, I think Charvarius Ward's better than any outside corner he's ever had.
Yeah,
Chidobe Uzie was solid, but he wasn't. I mean, Charvarius Ward was an all-pro last 2 years ago. Over the last 2 seasons, he's second in the NFL in pass breakups. This guy has in a long track record of doing it in the postseason. I think Nick Cross, when insulated in this role, can be similar to Von Bell. Probably give the slight edge to Bell right now, but when Bell got there, as you had laid out from the Saints, he had to take another step forward. Kenny Moore, we've made that comparison with Mike Hilton, two very similar players. And then Jalen Jones, though, I think that's better than Eli Apple, that Lou Anarumo was surviving that one really weak, chaotic spot at outside corner. I don't think they have a weakness like that the same way. There's other parts of the defense that are not on the same level. Linebacker, for sure, is the biggest area where they have to figure out something, and they don't have an edge like Trey Hendrickson, but they've got that guy, DeForest Buckner. But they have transformed this, and this is what I wanted to see out of them, because I had like no take to offer on the Lou Anarumo hire that in the moment that was that good, because my whole thing was I like it if they get in players, and I don't like it if they don't get in players, because like everything about him in his career suggested high ceiling and a very fun approach when you get him certain cornerstone players in coverage. And when you let those fall off, it can be really bad. And so the Colts had a choice of which of those they were going to do. Are they going to be somewhere in the middle? But to get two just really rock solid signings, I think was fun. You think about the safeties, like it's interesting with like Javon Holland, like everyone in the world was like, I don't know if his agent's just really good at building some hype, but like
his agent's David Mulugeta, who reps like everyone. So
yeah, he does get people paid, but like I was sniffing around a lot on Javon Holland. I know a couple sources with the Dolphins, and I wanted to figure out like, what am I missing? Looking at his production, it was just not that impressive. It was not many pass breakups.
It's less than Bynum.
He picked off like one Hail Mary over like a year and a half.
Yeah, it's less than Bynum's.
There's durability concerns, and it was the people I talked to. I mean, he's a good player for sure, but it wasn't. They didn't come back and say they thought he was like this top of the market player. So that's the way it played out. So among the guys that they could have gotten that fit what they needed. I liked Mayrig as a player a lot. Like you said, he plays in the box. I think Justin Reed could have been a really nice fit. He went to the Saints, but he's a little older, so that would have been like a little older player. I guess he's 28, but a couple years older than Bynum. That could have been like a little cheaper, a little older, shorter term deal type thing. But Bynum, I think, for what they're really looking for, fits in so many great ways between the versatility. He can play free safety, strong safety, and nickel, and I think that's underrated. They don't have a backup nickel, and if Kenny Moore goes down, I mean, that was something they were lucky didn't happen last year.
Well, now it's probably Womack.
Yeah,
Womack
if they don't want to move Bynum, but yeah, it's that probably does happen with getting Ward here too. But it is nice to have an extra option there. They just didn't have any options last year, and so Bynum, you've got like a player who's he's versatile, he's experienced, he's smart, he can handle all of that. And he has a good balance of skills. He's a good tackler. He's got good ball skills, good coverage. He's not like an amazing hitter or like an amazing athlete. He's not going to be Earl Thomas in single high, but they're not going to use him that way. That's not what Jesse Bates was. It's amazing to look back at Jesse Bates. I believe he was a 3rd round draft pick out of Wake Forest. I think that's when he went 3rd round, 2nd round. So he was a 2nd round pick out of Wake Forest. But I remember like he only got to Wake Forest because like no colleges recruited him at all. Like he kind of came out of nowhere as like he just wasn't a jump off the page athlete, but in that type of a split safety, rotate between the spots, disguise type of role, he ascended to in a crazy high level. And that's going to be the hope with Cam Bynum. We'll also think Bynum's just a really fun player. If you guys have looked into his turnover celebrations he was doing in Minnesota, choreographed like all of these based on different 90s movies and such. And like there's an element of that I think this team needed, like that sort of the balance between swagger, but also like being good enough to earn that. And just the kind of overall positive vibes he brought. Like this, it wasn't the top thing the Colts were looking for, but I just tell you, having spent the last year in that locker room, by the end of the season, that defensive culture is about as gross as anything I've been around. And so those comments from DeForest Buckner, that was what a lot of players were saying off the record, players who don't have the status of him to say that. It teetered off a freaking cliff. And so they had to do some things, not only talent level to fix this, but some of the personalities and backstories. And I think the mix of Bynum as this sort of like bright energy vibes guy with Charvarius Ward, who we can talk about too, who's been through some crazy life tragedies and come out and gotten through it and still getting through it right now. Like there's a real good mix of like life experience with these two, in addition to everything they've done on the field, which, by the way, funny stat is these two have played 13 playoff games since the last time any Colts players played a playoff game on defense. They're in the playoffs all the time. And so this is the kind of stuff they needed to add to this defense.
I think before we talk about Daniel Jones, I think linebacker at this point, a new weak side linebacker is most likely to come through the draft.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it was a position where finding like a bona fide like difference-making starter probably wasn't really possible. A lot of the best players at the position were re-signed to their original teams before free agency even started. Like I know a lot of people talked about Jamie and Sherwood. He was off the board. Bond was off the board. It just wasn't a position. Like, and the other thing about linebacker is, for the most part, Chris Ballard has been able to draft guys, and beyond the first round who can start. So they still need to add somebody there. I just don't think it's going to come from free agency. I could still see a signing or two, but something on the lower end. Defensive line feels like there could be an addition if the right deal presents itself with Odengbo leaving. I know Ebicom's back, but they went into last season expecting to have all those guys together. So yeah, I would think that the linebacker is the big hole in the starting lineup. And I would think that that's probably going to be a draft spot now.
Yeah, I think the point you made early fits into this really well about understanding like what positions Chris Ballard is good at drafting and when he's not. And so he went after the ones that have not worked out as well in the draft, safety and cornerback. You could even say quarterback. But the ones he is a nice track record drafting, you would say two of the ones you'd put up on high on that list are linebacker and guard. Those are the two spots that the big like starters they need that they don't have a starter at that are left out there. And so that I think is become more likely for the draft, which also fits pretty well for those positions. Linebackers this year are very, very fun in the draft. There's some first round guys, but a lot of second and third round guys that can actually cover blitz, all the kind of stuff that they're going to want out of that weak side linebacker, the stuff that they have not had at that spot since Bobby Okereke and before Shaq Leonard got hurt that they badly need. That's, I think, going to be a good spot. It's also good that they, with linebacker specifically, left that open because what they need to not have happen is to box themselves in so much that the only position that makes sense for them in the first round is tight end. There was a chance of that. Like, I don't think it'd be good for them to be like, well, we got sniped in Tyler Warren and Colson Loveland, so we're just going to take a guard at 14. I don't know that was going to be the best thing. So there's some linebacker options that I think are worth that kind of consideration now that they took themselves kind of out of safety and corner making sense in the first round. So yeah, I think that makes sense. Drake Greenlaw was the one linebacker I thought was a very fun idea for them, but he just got way too expensive with what else they were going to do. He signed 3 years, $35 million. And when you think about the contracts too, it also made sense to the draft is going to offset what they're paying Zaire Franklin and keep that position intact. Like the thing that many have rightly complained about with Chris Ballard's front office over the years is that they put too much money in non-premium positions and almost nothing into the premium ones. And so this offseason was a big shift between not filling a linebacker spot that way, letting a guard go for a lot of money and pumping that money into cornerback and big time safety. It's just very different than how they've done it across the board. And so it just shows you that I think the best mix of Chris Ballard is to still tap into his strengths, which is certain positions he can draft and set up that way. Some of the bargain bin stuff can still work while also really going hard after his weaknesses, which have been some of those premium positions and actually getting high level free agents to fill major needs. So far, it's off to a pretty nice start.
Yeah. The sentence from the time the sentence from the combine that sticks out to me on the offensive line is that Ballard said he thought there were a lot of really good players. Like he said, he thought the offensive line class was really deep in the middle rounds. And I just kind of checked the box in my head and was like, okay, Matt Gonzalez, Tanner Bortolini style pick incoming in the third or fourth round.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is interesting there too. We'll tie this into a couple of different points I'm sure we'll get into, but I do think it's interesting. Like you had written on Will Fries, and you had this in your story that they were interested in him, but they had a price point. Like they had a certain level. And what's interesting is they usually do that with all the outside free agents, right? Like, oh, we're into them, but we're not going above this level. And so they don't get any of the good ones. But they seem to not have that for their in-house guys very much. I thought last year when they brought all these guys back, I think you could make an argument for the players they brought back. I think they overdid. I don't think they used their leverage enough with a couple of them. 3 of them come to mind, actually. I thought they could have gotten better deals last year on – well, they just didn't need to extend Zaire Franklin at the moment that they did. And then I even thought like Grover Stewart coming off a suspension as a 2-down player, and even Kenny Moore. And I know the nickel market is catching up this year, so maybe that one was just trending in that direction. But the point I'm making though is they just don't seem to. They don't usually do that where they say, "Hey, we're interested in you, but we're not going above this level. And if you've got to leave, fine." But they were willing to do it this year with Will Fries, who's a really good player, but it was Chris Ballard recognizing like there's got to be a limit to how much I'm going to pay 2 guards on this team that has a lot of these other needs. And they set a line. The Vikings gave him a tremendous deal. And the other thing that's an interesting shift is that Chris Ballard also, one of his big flaws is betting too much on one of his own players come back from a big injury. So I think with Will Fries, it made sense to keep that in check a little bit. Not, I think you could have confidence that he'll come back from what he's dealing with if they have good information, but it is still a gamble. And so keep that in check. And that's ultimately what they did.
Samson Ebukam also, though.
Yeah. That's the one that is not so far getting corrected.
Yeah, Fries. I think the other thing that's looming is Bernhard Raimann. Is he's played 3 years in the NFL. He's eligible for an extension. The Colts typically do those more towards the summer, and from my understanding, that's what guys like Raimann and Pierce have been told is let's get through free agency and see where we're at, and then we'll start talking about like how the structure looks and stuff like that. Usually those come in like June-ish, or if it takes a little longer, end of training camp is when those things happen. But Raimann plays a much more premier position, than what Fries does, and doesn't have the significant injury. You want to be able to, you should pay a left tackle if it's a good left tackle, and Raimann looks like he's going to be a good left tackle for a while. So I think that's the other piece of the Fries thing is knowing what they have coming down the pike in terms of offensive linemen. That definitely probably played a role in. And there might be a difference there too, because for a long time they had a tackle, a center, and a guard making premium money on the previous lines. And if it continues to go the way it is, they would have 2 guys making premium money, because the assumption is that after this year, well, they've already reduced at least the cap hit for Smith, I'm assuming. Still don't know what that deal is as of right now, so we don't know their cap space. But he'll likely move on after this season, and then you're paying your left tackle, and you're paying a guy who's probably going to the Hall of Fame at this point, and everybody else would be a younger player in that scenario.
Yeah, and again, when you talk about like where do you go to address certain needs, it makes way more sense to draft a mid-round guard than to try to go that route on a tackle. I mean, Bernhard Raimann has worked out in the long term, but even that one, they took him in the 3rd round because of his, kind of longer transition from, growing up in Austria and all of that. And right away, the first year, it was an absolute disaster. It just was like, it was not a thing. If you're going to get a mid-round tackle, it's usually because of that. There's long-term upside, but he's not ready to play. Those guys just get pushed up too much. And so but a mid-round guard, you can find those guys. If your line is set a certain way and it's the right guy, they can come right in and be a pretty good player year one. We've probably both covered guys in this league that have been rookies 3rd, 4th round that have been pretty good year one.
The Packers feel like a team that their lines are like built on this tenet. Find some guard in the 4th round and the guy makes 3 Pro Bowls or something.
When you talk about this draft class too, if you look through it, there's a lot of these guys that are like, they probably need to move to guard. Like they're on the edge of like, they're trying to be short arms, or that's a big part of it. That's a big part. I mean, even like Will Campbell's, he could be a top 5 pick. He's got short arms. There's a lot of guys that like, maybe they can cut it as a tackle, but they'll probably be a really good guard. And so there's value in drafting a guy specifically with that guard position in mind for him, when that's what you're looking for. It'll be interesting to see what they do there, because also I don't know if Matt Gonzalez is a guy that they look at as a possible starter there. I don't know if they'd rather save him as a swing tackle for this year who could take over at right tackle next year. But that's also kind of a good thing, is that gives them a couple of options if the draft does go a certain way.
I don't think they would move Braden Smith, but I did find myself wondering if like playing the interior might be easier on his knee.
Yeah.
At this point in his career.
I mean, especially when you think he's a lot better as a run blocker at this point. So
I did wonder if that was just given what he's dealt with on the knee. I wondered if like maybe they had that thought. We'll find out all that stuff when we get to camp. Okay, we have managed to do 35 minutes on positions that aren't quarterback. We would be remiss if we didn't bring up the quarterback, despite the fact that we've talked about it for, I think, 757 straight podcasts. I think that's the actual number.
The streak's not going to end.
They signed Daniel Jones. Realistically, this is my first and only thought that like thing that jumped out at me right away. Like, that's the best option they could probably get in free agency. You know, Justin Fields was never going to compete for a starting job when the Jets wanted him to be their starter. Like, it doesn't even look like the Jets have a draft pick that they can get somebody. So like an actual starting role, Fields was always going to take that over it. Darnold got $110 million. The Colts weren't paying that. I'm not convinced the Seahawks should have paid that. It is the going rate for a guy in his situation. I'm not convinced that he's Baker Mayfield.
Are you saying it's weird when you let your two good wide receivers leave and then you bring in a new quarterback and you give him Marquez Valdes-Scantling to throw to?
Marquez Valdes-Scantling can run very fast. And that is all I will say about that. So Sam Darnold was never realistic just in terms of 3 years, $110 million. That was the deal. In fact, that's pretty much just an inflation-adjusted version of what I said he was going to get, which is the Mayfield deal, which in Tampa Bay they gave him 3 years, $100 million. And that left Jones in terms of younger players, because as we've mentioned before, and right now while we're talking, there's lots of Aaron Rodgers rumors, because there's always Aaron Rodgers rumors. The Giants and Steelers are waiting on him, but those guys are starters. Those guys don't want to compete. Aaron Rodgers is not coming here to compete. Jones was, if you were looking for real competition, I think Jones was your best option on the free agent market. I think ideally, I still think if there was a guy in this draft class, but no one thinks that there's a guy in this draft class. We're going to hear a lot of stuff about it right now, but in the next couple of months. And maybe there is a guy in the draft class who's a diamond in the rough, but everything I heard from people at the combine was this draft class stinks at quarterback. So Daniel Jones, if you're looking for real competition, obviously huge warts, and I'm sure we'll get into those, but probably your best option, most realistic option.
Yeah, and you also see why they came out and said at the combine this is an open competition, because they weren't going to get Daniel Jones if it wasn't that. Daniel Jones was very happy in terms of if he was going to be a backup, he was in the best spot possible that you could be a backup already in Minnesota. He's learning under Kevin O'Connell, who's gotten Kirk Cousins and Sam Darnold paid like crazy. He's backing up J.J. McCarthy, who is coming off a second knee injury. So there's a chance to step in. And if he stepped in, you're throwing to Justin Jefferson and T.J. Hawkinson and Jordan Addison, and maybe he ends up getting paid. So it was very tempting to stay there. And I think that's why that one took a little bit longer than people maybe thought.
I don't believe for a second, and I'm curious to hear did you see the NFL Network report that the NFL Network reported that the Vikings backed out when Jones didn't immediately sign? I don't have any intel on this. I'm just going to tell you, as somebody who covered the SEC, when the recruit goes elsewhere, you say we didn't want him anyway.
There was no reason to take that approach with a backup quarterback either. So no, that's silly. So it was a mix of things. So the Colts had to get competitive with the situation. They had to get competitive with the offer. They paid him $14 million. If he plays and he hits certain playing time incentives and goes to the playoffs and all that, he can get up to $17 million. I believe that's going to make him the highest paid backup this year. Once I still believe that the Falcons will move on from Kirk Cousins. If they don't, then Kirk Cousins will quadruple that, and that'll be a funny situation. But the Colts are making this the highest paid backup in the league. This conversation is tough for me because maybe it's just a semantics thing. I like Daniel Jones a ton better as a backup quarterback than as competition. And maybe those are the same thing at the end of the day. Maybe it's a competition only as far as kind of monitoring the offseason and then, inspiring Anthony Richardson to rise up, and then he does, and he takes over. If it works that way, the way that they're hoping, the way they need to, and Anthony Richardson is just such a different player come training camp. He's got a higher ceiling than Daniel Jones. So even if Daniel Jones works crazy hard, like talent-wise, he's not going to be able to catch him. And then Anthony he starts week 1 and he's really good, and we don't look back. Then I love the move, because then all of a sudden you were paying $14 million for the highest paid backup, but a backup at a position that they have a lot of injuries. And so then the other thing that made Daniel Jones a unique fit here, and why I came around a little bit on the idea, is that I really thought they needed a mobile backup. I thought last year they really got into a pickle with Anthony Richardson's injury concerns, and then a backup who was so polar opposite on that level. And I just thought they kept going back and forth between, do we want to be a run-centric team? Do we want to be a deep shot team to keep the hits off of him? And then it's like we run some, then he gets hurt. Now the next week, and Shane Steichen likes to adjust that. Like, he's adaptable, but not all the players are adaptable to that. They had young players that I thought that just kind of freaked out. And so I think, and I think the other problem is that they became so afraid of losing Anthony early in the season that they weren't willing to run him. Now, if you had a situation where he's playing really well as a starter, but there's still that present injury risk, because of Daniel Jones, you still feel like we can run him to the level we want to run him within reason. If he has to miss a game or two, which happens to pretty much every mobile quarterback anyway, at least to miss, a game or two here or there, you can put Daniel Jones in. The offensive, a lot of the run game identity and approach stays the same. I get it on that level. I still don't love the idea of the competition, because I think that's something that is great to say right now, and it's great to think through, and this dreamy idea that it'll inspire Anthony and he'll just rise up. I think in practice, when they get out there and they're splitting the reps, when they've told us what Anthony Richardson needs more than anything is reps, and they're switching, one day he's taking the first team reps and the next day someone else is, and that's what you're going to put onto Alec Pierce and Josh Downs and A.D. Mitchell and a rookie tight end. 2 of those players I named are pretty big deep threats that I don't think fit with Daniel Jones. I think there's a chance this gets messy. And maybe that's just the heart of the debate anyway with Anthony. It's either going to work or it's going to really go off kilter again. So maybe it's just an extension of that. I just don't think I think some people have framed this as like, oh, this makes so much sense. They got the best backup out there, and it's like, in these competition, he'll inspire Anthony. It's like there are downsides and risks to this move that I think are going to play out in ways that become very real in August and September that don't feel that way right now.
I don't actually think it's about inspiring Anthony. I think it's an acknowledgement that Richardson hasn't been very good.
See, I like that idea less, to be honest with you. If that's the
I think it's an acknowledgement that Richardson has not been a very good quarterback so far. And you might need to move on from him. That's if it's about inspiring Anthony. I know that's an expensive bet to make. It's an expensive emotional play for something that I know he's young, but honestly, he should get it by now. Like, especially after last year, you should get like that. This is going to be a high pressure situation, and you have to figure it out. I think that the Colts have to come to grips with the fact that he has not been very good so far, and they might need another option.
I hear that. I like the move less if that's why they're doing it, though, because I don't think Daniel Jones is good enough to be a starter. I think that's what he's shown us so far. And who knows? He spent some time under Kevin O'Connell, who has some magical ways of turning guys around. It wasn't very long, and he didn't get game reps. I don't think you can assume it's like what's going on with Sam Darnold. Daniel Jones, that's why the thing about, like, there's certain guys like that, like, who you love as backups, and then they're not the same as starters. That's kind of where Daniel Jones is fitting in for me. You go back to when he was drafted, the Giants took him 6th overall, and everyone hated it. and they did it because he was such a he was the idea of what they wanted the next quarterback to be after Eli Manning. This all this stuff, all the good traits about him are like he's a consummate worker and his teammates love him, and he's kind of unrattled in the public eye for a market like New York. And he was trained under the same quarterback coach that Eli had. It was such a very specific thing. But the problem with him was he doesn't throw downfield. He doesn't have a lot of arm talent. I don't think it's the same thing as Sam Darnold or Baker Mayfield, who had a better arm and a lot of teams were into as a top 5 pick. It wasn't just a one team type thing. I think Daniel Jones, you look at him, he had a nice rookie year, kind of came out of nowhere and threw 24 touchdowns to 12 picks. In the, 5 seasons since that rookie season, he's started 57 games and has thrown 46 touchdowns. He has never in his career had more than 6.8 yards an attempt. So I think he has one really, really good skill, which is the mobility. And that's why I love him as a backup. There are not a lot of backups that bring that, quite frankly. And I think they needed in this offense to keep that stable. They need to build their identity about this backfield and be able to play in a similar playbook game to game. But overall, as a total package, I kind of see him as Gardner Minshew with legs, and that is a very defined ceiling. You like that?
I'm being 12 right now. I gotta look something up real fast. Keep going.
Okay, that just popped in my head, so it was funny. It's just, and in the AFC, I just there's a reason why the Geno Smith, Sam Darnold, Baker Mayfield reclamation projects, they all sign in the NFC. It doesn't work in the AFC. We'll see if Justin Fields does it, but I don't think the ceiling is there for Daniel Jones to actually unseat this. So if Anthony Richardson is struggling enough to lose his job, and that's what Daniel Jones is here to step in, I'm still kind of where I was coming into this whole thing, which is they're just asking to become the Pittsburgh Steelers, which nobody wants to be right now.
You might have derailed me completely. I don't know if I'm going to recover from this. You said Gardner Minshew with legs, and I pictured Gardner Minshew, but with a tall person's legs. So the thing I was looking up was their heights. And Gardner Minshew is 6'1", and Daniel Jones is 6'5".
Yep. What was it? His nickname was. Do you remember the nickname that Saquon Barkley gave Daniel Jones?
I don't remember.
Vanilla Vic.
Gardner Minshew with legs is going to stick in my head, though. That's the
Vanilla Vic.
Yeah, I don't think Daniel Jones is very. They're hoping for something. Ballard keeps going back to this over the offseason. I listened back to what he told us at the combine. He didn't say it in the full. It didn't come up in the full scrum, but it did when he went on the Fan the next morning. He keeps coming back to this idea that guys who are high first round picks and fail somewhere are now being successful other places. He's really kind of harped on that over and over again, and I think that's what's in his head. The vast majority of those guys still end up not working out, and the Colts should know that because Carson Wentz did the same thing here. Carson Wentz was a more successful player in Philadelphia who they brought in thinking, if we just change his scenery, it'll give him a better chance to get better. And in reality, that doesn't often happen. Jones, his passing profile is really kind of boring. Mm-hmm. He's going to complete passes. He doesn't throw the ball downfield. I guess if you want to, you can try to say well, the Giants didn't have as good of an offensive line, or they haven't had anything at receiver for a while. Okay, flip side, he doesn't avoid sacks the way Richardson does. And his intended air yards are either middle or low, sometimes at the bottom of the thing. So Gardner Minshew with legs is not necessarily, based on what we've seen, it's funny, but it's also probably true. They're hoping if he takes over, they're hoping for something that I don't know if it's in the profile. Mayfield, I have liked Baker Mayfield for a long time, so I set him apart from those other guys. because I think he had more success in Cleveland. Like he had a really good year in Cleveland.
2 really good years, actually, his rookie year and his third year.
Yeah, Baker Mayfield showed some real flashes that I don't think we saw as much of from Darnold. And Jones doesn't really have those. Like it kind of feels a little bit like, well, we've tried every other route. Let's see if we can get this new one that seems to be cropping up in case it doesn't work out with Richardson. I don't know that it's going to work out that way. I just think in terms of like what the Colts are thinking, the alternative, they put themselves in this spot because they're not. Chris Ballard has always preached patience with guys. It paid off with Cross and with Pierce last year. I think that's probably his most consistent message is don't throw young players out before they're fully cooked. Don't take them out of the oven too early. And he believes that with Richardson. But by believing that with Richardson, you put yourself in this scenario where if you don't feel like he's been good enough, but you still want to give him a chance, you can't actually get a real replacement. You know what I mean? Because to get a real replacement, you'd have to open the job, And so I do think they're kind of stuck in the middle there again. But I also think that there's an acknowledgement from them that just, Richardson has to be a lot better to credibly be the starting quarterback of this team. And so that's why I think it ends up being Daniel Jones, is because they're looking for somebody that they feel like gives them some upside. Does he? He gives them some upside in that he's 4 inches taller than Gardner Minshew, and that's up. But in terms of like the way they're thinking about it, I think there's an acknowledgement there that if Richardson comes out and starts playing and looks the same way that he did last year, that's not tenable. We have to move on.
Yeah. I mean, I get that. When you look back at Daniel Jones, like with the Giants, you can make arguments.
Minshew with legs. I can't like you've ruined this. You've ruined me for the rest of the podcast. I'm giggling every time you say his name.
I'm either going to refer to him as that or Vanilla Vic was his name from.
I don't like that one as much. That one's not as fun. Gardner Minshew with legs is more fun.
When Gardner Minshew with legs was on the Giants,
like a chicken with turkey's legs.
Yeah. When Gardner with legs was on the Giants, you could make an argument on both sides of like the situation he was in. On one level, their offensive line was really bad. They did a really bad job building the offensive line around him. The wide receivers, until Malik Neighbors got there last year and he got 10 games with him, pretty not good. I mean, he was thrown to like Darius Slayton was like his best outside receiver. He had Evan Ingram early on and then not after that. So talent-wise, for the most part, you can argue that. Also, though, he had Saquon Barkley for the year that got him paid. And playing off that, as a dual-threat quarterback was wonderful. Maybe that makes him a good fit here with Jonathan Taylor. But also, I mean, he's playing for Brian Daboll, and Brian Daboll isn't like considered the same star he was a couple years ago, but at the same time, like it's been the same coach, the same system. I don't think you look and say they have just all this, like he didn't get caught in one of these dysfunctional, unstable environments that usually is what fries young quarterbacks. And then the ones that succeed later are the ones that get out of those dysfunctional messes. So you think about like Baker Mayfield started his career with Freddie Kitchens. He had like 3 offense coordinators in his first 3 seasons. He started with Hugh Jackson and then Freddie Kitchens. And so you look at Sam Darnold and Geno Smith. Well, the Jets have put on a clinic of instability and just horrible, horrible coaching for a long time there. Justin Fields is the new one that I think he has a better chance of doing this, partly because I think he has more natural talent, but also the Bears are very, very, very good at messing up quarterbacks and putting them in very odd positions and weird ways that they use them, and using a system that didn't fit his abilities at all. And so we'll see now if the Jets can replicate that. But Daniel Jones, I just don't know that there's enough ceiling to pull back out. Like Sam Darnold, I was very into coming into the draft that year because everything about him, he's got all this like personal stuff that Daniel Jones does as a leader and teammate, but also thought like his build and his willingness to take risks down the field, like there was upside there, even though it could get chaotic. I just don't know that Daniel Jones has that. I just don't know that he has the ceiling as a passer. And it'll be interesting to see how he would fit if he stepped in here, because on one level, Shane has made that work with the Gardner Minshew who didn't have the legs, working off RPOs and kind of quick passing. That works fairly well. But what also happened that year is what was Alec Pierce up to with the Gardner Minshew offense? A.D. Mitchell, I think, is still more of a player that's going to be about getting down the field. This vertical approach that Shane Steichen really likes, that goes away pretty quickly. And I just wonder how it's going to play out in training camp, where when they switch between these two, the run game can probably stay the same, very, very similar. But I do think it's going to be something where, with Anthony back there, Alec Pierce and A.D. Mitchell, all their routes are going to change when Daniel Jones comes in there. And are we going to do that every other day with these guys? It's the process of actually playing this competition out I'm struggling a little bit with. And also the fact that, like, if they're going to say, like, we're going with the best man wins the job, they need to stick to that. And so if that's Daniel Jones, then I guess start Daniel Jones week 1. But what I could see happening is that they know the upside in their futures are tied to Anthony Richardson. If they think that way and they start him because they want him to ascend, but maybe they're even in camp, or maybe Daniel Jones is a little bit above. I mean, you've told your team we're going to play the best quarterback. They know who the best quarterback is going to be there. They're going to watch it and face it. Like, there's a certain level of promise they've got to follow up on. So if it's what you're describing, then they will do that. But I could also see a scenario where, if it's more what I think, that this is really about really just bringing out everything they can possibly bring out in Anthony Richardson. I don't know. Either way, if Anthony wins it, actually, if either guy wins it, that guy, they need someone to win it, like, in a landslide, because otherwise every week we're going to be asking, who's your starting quarterback? And those questions ate Shane Steichen for dinner last year. And maybe he's learned a lot, and maybe they're going to work with him on messaging and some of that leadership stuff to handle it differently. But that's the situation that is a little scary. Now, I guess what you could argue is you brought this up with Anthony, like, if he can't handle this, is he built for the NFL? Maybe that's the case with Shane too. We're going to learn a lot about him as a head coach. If he can't handle these two the right way, then he isn't meant to be a head coach. So maybe that's a fair test on them all. But I don't think this is a move that I think has some upside of it, if it gives them a great backup and brings stuff out of Anthony in that way. But I also think there's a way that this gets very dramatic and messy by, like, week 3.
Yeah. I just think that, I know his injuries have played a role in this. He's only played 15 games, but 3 years in, if you can't beat Daniel Jones out in training camp after what we assume is going to be a healthy offseason, is it ever going to happen?
Sure.
Obviously he's got the physical tools, but we haven't really seen him realize those physical tools outside of the flash plays. And we found out last year that the flash plays aren't enough, especially against good teams. So I think that's to me, that's the thing, is if it does come down to Richardson, and Richardson is their best chance if he figures it out. It's just, I think, looking at the way he's played the first 2 years, you have to be honest with yourself at this point and think it might not ever happen.
Yeah. Now, that's fair. I will say one thing about this that turned out better than what I thought might happen with this signing, is that it didn't keep them from signing guys on defense and really going after their needs. The fear I had was that they were going to sell this as their aggressive move. And it's like, you're at best, you're going to sub one position out for another. You're not actually raising this level, this team, in a dramatic way. Now they're setting it up to where there is going to be less on whoever is the quarterback to like be everything and lift everything like right out of the gates. They shouldn't have games like the Jaguars and Giants games last year where it felt like it didn't really matter what the quarterback did because the defense was such an utter disaster. They are giving them a better team, but they still have some work to do on that because I think one thing that's we talked about it already, but like the offensive line is going to hold a lot of keys here because Daniel Jones didn't have that in New York, and we've seen how that played out. I'm very curious to see how they go and attack this because there's been versions where Chris Ballard's put together an offensive line like in 2023 that was great. There's also been years where he's had a couple of areas he's had to replace, like 2022, namely right guard, and that has really spiraled things. So if they can get a good offensive line, then you can talk yourself into almost everything about this team that's not quarterback. They've got 3 receivers who had 800 yards, and we'll see with A.D. Mitchell. Like maybe they'll have a first-round tight end. At least they got to have one by round 2, you would think. They've got Jonathan Taylor. They've got a defense now that has a secondary that I think is a legitimate strength on top of at least a solid pass rush led by an all-pro DeForest Buckner. They should be a good team if they can get the offensive line figured out. But the downside, the way that it would teeter would be if you have a mix of you have an offensive line that's shuffling guys and is problematic with quarterbacks shuffling in and out. Have we ever covered that here before? So it's such a critical I'm saying nothing original at this point, but it is such a critical offseason for them they have to nail this stuff right now. And like for this guy, if it's Anthony stepping up for Daniel Jones, for them to have a chance to succeed, that offensive line has to not be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And the hard truth is that in either case, it's unlikely at this point.
Oh yeah.
In both quarterbacks' case, it's the odds are against either of them playing playoff caliber quarterback play, which that's not a fun way to end the podcast. So we're getting close to the league year. We're gonna have to sign off here pretty soon, but they did sign Camryn Bynum and Charvarius Ward. You think that makes people feel better after I said the other thing that was not fun?
It should. I will say I am reinvigorated, to be honest with you. Like, just as a quick aside, like last season, a lot of fans have said it was a tough season to deal with. Just it was confusing, it was weird, it wasn't the young quarterback wasn't doing the things that you hoped for. The team was kind of boring. It was really hard to cover that team too. Not just because of some of that drama and whatnot, but like they didn't bring anybody new onto that team outside of a couple rookies who weren't playing very well. And like, that's not very fun to write about. Like, it was just really hard to like tell a lot of big time new stories with guys that they just rolled everything back, and we kind of knew what a lot of them were. So I'm reinvigorated to tell some of the stories, to get to know Camryn Bynum and Charvarius Ward and Daniel Jones, to write about their journeys here, their backstories, their experience, and then see how like this all comes together. Like we knew too many things about last year, like that their secondary was going to struggle. This year, there's a lot of newness there just with that position group. It's going to be true in the offensive line too. So there's a lot of risk with this team and ways it can go wrong, like we just laid out. But I think it is at least it's a super interesting time for them to all be in this sort of make or break year where the roster's changing and some big time players are coming in here. It's very different than it's been the past couple of years.
See, Nate saved it. Don't listen to Joel's negativity. Just skip right over that 15 seconds.
I'm just bringing the ray of light now because who knows where we'll be by week 3 of covering all this.
For the Colts Cover-2 Podcast, I'm Joel Erickson. This is Nate Atkins. Nate is on vacation next week, so I don't know what we'll do with the pod. Maybe I'll come up with something. Maybe I won't. We'll find out. Haven't thought about it much. Spent most of my time in contracts and text messages and all that stuff. There's more free agency to come. We will cover as much of it as the Colts do, which this year, more than normal.